This tutorial is divided into 4 sections. First is the introduction of the app we have till now. Second is email and password sign-in. Third is state persistence, which means to keep the logged in users logged in. Fourth is sign out. We will be using provider for state management and MongoDB to store the data. So I have an application ready with me which consists of all the UI files of the application, which is the home screen. This screen is only visible when we have surpassed the login and the sign up screen. Next is the login screen, which will only be accessible when we click on this button, and it shows up the screen, a text, 2 text fields which have their text controllers, and the login button. I also have a sign up screen which is similar to the login screen, and it has 3 text fields because it also wants the name of the user and this login user button. All the 3 text fields look similar to each other because of this custom text field widget. This is a common widget used across all the screens to display a text field. I also have the utils.dart file with me, which has only one function, which is show snack bar. This function will display a snack bar whenever it's needed, especially in case of errors. I also have the server folder where I've ran the npm init command. If you're wondering how I did that, here it is. I first created a folder using this command, then I migrated into that folder, then I ran this command, and there we have it. Our server is created. Here we need to create a file called as index.js and then install some of the dependencies that we need. The dependencies that we need are bcrypt.js so that we can secure our password when storing it to the database, express so that we can quickly create routes. Then we need JSON web token, which is JWT, and helps in securely transmitting information. And then finally Mongo, so that we can interact with MongoDB quickly. And if you're not using MongoDB as your database, then you can definitely remove this and add in your own dependencies that you might need. I'll click on enter just to install them using npm I. You can also use npm install. It's just a shorter format, no difference. After the installation of all these dependencies are done, we need another dependency, but not as a dependency, but as a dev dependency. To save it as a dev dependency, you need to run npm I, then the name of the package, which is nodemon, which will help us continuously restart our server whenever there is any change in our file, and then -- save dependency as a dev dependency. Alright. Then click on enter. After that process is completed, we can go to the package.json file and see our dependencies and dev dependencies correctly. In the scripts file, we need to remove the existing script and instead add this line, which is dev nodemon./index.js. This means whenever npm run dev command is executed in the terminal, we want this command to get run. Another script that we need is start. Whenever npm start is executed, we want this command to get executed. In our index.js file, we'll first of all import all the dependencies that were there. For now, we just need express and mongoose because we need to connect the database in our index.js file, and also so that we can convert all the incoming requests to JSON. You'll see that in the next lines. Another thing that we need is a port. So if there is any .env variable where there is port, we need to use that. If that's undefined or it's not there anywhere in our application, then we need 3000. This comes in help, especially when we are deploying our app to Heroku or any other website. Then we need to initialize this express into a variable. So let's have app, and this will initialize the express package that we created. After that, we will use express.json as middleware. This basically makes sure that whatever requests that are coming to our server gets passed and are in JSON format. After that, we need to make sure that we listen to our application and start our server. So we need app.listen. Then we need to pass in the port we are at, and this is from the port variable. Then we need the IP, which means 0.0.0, which means accessible from anywhere, and then a callback function. So whenever the listen is set to true, or that means our app has started listening, what do we want? What do we want to get executed? So here we are just going to print out that yeah, it has been connected to this port, and it will just print it out in the terminal. Let's try to run our app. So I'll press Ctrl J to get my terminal up and running. Then I'm going to run the command npm run dev. As you can see, nodemon got executed because of our package.json, and here we also have connected at port 3000. Next step is to connect our app to MongoDB. If you're not using MongoDB, make sure to quick this step. Look at the timestamps given in the description below, and you can follow when I get to the other authentication part. So I'm going to be using MongoDB that's available on the net. If you want, you can go ahead and install MongoDB locally on your app machine and then use it, whatever you want. But after you reach this website, which is mongodb.com, just click over here on the sign in, and then you'll get to this login part. If you don't already have an account, click on sign up. If you do have, then log into your account using email address, Google, or whatever you have with it. I'm going to sign in and then see you in the next step. After you've logged in, and if you see a screen like this, then great. If you don't, then you'll have to follow the incoming processes. That means you've created a new account, so you'll have to follow those processes. Just manually enter whatever you're doing, and then you land on page something looking like this, where you need to click over here, click on new project, and here you need to enter your project name. I'll just name it Node Auth Tutorial. After that, click on next, then just click on create a project, and here, as it instructs you, we need to create a database. So we'll build a database. We're going to go with the free option, but if you want, you can just look into this. After that, I'm going to see all the default options and keep the same, and then click on create cluster. Here you need to enter a username and a password, which are very crucial for the connection purposes. So whatever you enter, make sure that they're correct and you can use it later on. So I'm going to pass in Rivaan as a username and then a password, and then click on create user. After that, I need to add an IP address, which means 0.0.0, so that I can allow access from anywhere, and then click on finish and close. Then I'll go to the databases again. Right now they're deploying the changes, so I can wait. Having the database built, I'll click on this connect option so that I can take the database and connect it to my application. I'm going to connect the app using MongoDB's native drivers because I already have the Nodejs. Then I'm going to copy this, go over here, create a variable called db, and then pass in the URL. After that, we need to take this username, which MongoDB has already put in, and then replace the password. Now you need to include these angle brackets, make sure to include them, exclude them, and then add in the password. I've already added in here. Don't try to take my URL. I'll be deleting this project after this tutorial. So now to connect the Nodejs application to MongoDB, I'm going to use Mongoose that I've imported. I'm going to use Mongoose. So let's have Mongoose here, and it provides us with an option of .connect, which will help us connect to our database. After that is done, then we just, since this is a promise, which is basically a future in Dart, we need to use .then. And if the connection is successful, then what do we need to do? Well, I'll just type in connection successful, and if there's an error, we'll catch it using catch, and then print that the connection or the error, what caused that error. And then I'll just save this much, and then here you can see connected at port 3000 and connection was successful. After that is done, we need to dive into the auth part. So for authentication, how we are going to handle this is create a new folder here called routers, and here create a file called auth.js. In here, first we'll import Express so that we can create our APIs here. Then we will create auth router variable, which is express.router. Here we are basically creating our own router that we can use instead of app.get. We'll use authrouter.get or authrouter.post. You'll get to know in just a second, and then we'll just export this auth router so that we can use it in the index.js file. Here, instead of writing our ports or our routes manually over here like app.get, what we're going to use is app.use and then pass in auth router. Here we are also going to import it from routes/auth and then just save it. It just makes our code neater so that everything is not just stuck in just one file. Auth will be done in auth file, and other functionality of your app can be added in different other files and used similarly like this. After this, we are going to create our first route, which is Signup Route. So here I'm going to use authrouter.post. As I said, here we would have used express.router. express.get, where we are using authrouter.post. Then we need to pass in the URL, which is /API/signup. This URL basically means what way do we need to connect. If we pass in /API/signup, that means we'll have to use localhost 3000 /API/signup to get to this route. If we pass in /signup, then that would mean we just need to pass in localhost 3000 /signup to get to this route and access the information. Then we want this function, or the callback function that we're going to have, asynchronous. So basically, whenever a post request is sent to this URL, what do we need to do? Well, this callback function is going to decide that, and it's going to be asynchronous because here we're going to talk to our MongoDB and post some data over there. Then we are just going to get a request and a response there, and now our main part will start. What do we need to do? Let's analyze that. First of all, we need to get the name, email and username of the user that the user has typed in over here. So we have to destructure it first. Second step is to take the email and find any other user that's there in our database with that email. If that email is there, that means that the user is not signing up. The user is already existing. So that means that the user should sign in. Third step is to hash the password. Whatever password the user types in over here is going to be in plain English, but we can't store plain English in our database. What if our database had to get hijacked or hacked? So what would you do in that case? So we need to secure that password by turning it into gibberish. Of course, we could turn it into gibberish, but then what's the point of asking for password? And how would the user know what their password is? So for that, we're going to use bcrypt.js. We'll look into that when we get to it. Fourth step is to create the user model, which we're going to create in just a while. After getting done with the signup route, we'll create that user model, which stores all the user data, which is basically the structure of how our user is going to look like. And we're going to use Mongoose for that because MongoDB and Mongoose have a very clean way of doing it. Final task is just to throw any error in case it's there. And then we need to connect our signup route to our client side. So these are the 6 steps that we need to follow. So let's get started with it. First was destructuring. So let's first of all have a try catch block because that's the error handling part. And here we're going to showcase any error, which is our 6th step. Now the first step is destructuring. We need to destructure from rec.body because when we are on the client side, we're going to extract data from request.body. Here we're going to get the name, email and password. Make sure that these names are there as it is because these are going to play a very vital role when we get to the client side of doing this. Because we need to pass in the same stuff as this in our client side. Now the second step, we need to find an existing user. We'll do that using existing user await user.findOne. And if you're wondering what user is, we're going to create that user model right now. We're going to create that user model in just a second. But basically what we're doing is searching in our whole MongoDB database if there is any user with this email. And here we don't need to pass an email. This is a shorthand syntax when the value and the key both are the same thing. So in our entire database, if there is a user with this email, then it will store that in the existing user. For any other database, you can search it up on the net how to find it and then use that logic. It might not be one line, but of course you can write all of that logic and then you'll have that existing user with you. Now, of course, if that existing user is there, then we need to check that. So if there is an existing user, we need to throw a message saying that this user already exists. So we'll just use return and make sure to use return over here because we don't want to execute any further in our function, this callback function. We don't want to go ahead. And here we're going to return res.status 400. 400 means bad request. And if we just do res.message or res.json to send a message, it will have a status code of 200. We don't want that. We want 400 to be shown up because that's a bad error. And this status code is also going to play a very important role in the client side. Then we just want .json and here we are going to pass in a message. This is how we are going to read the message in our client side using this property, and then we are going to have user with the same email already exists. Instead of message we are using JSON. If you want you can also use message. It wouldn't really matter. I just like using JSON because it returns a JSON response. So after having return keyword mentioned here, it means if the existing user is there, then we are just going to send this message and then return from this function, not moving ahead. But in case there is no user, that means that the user is trying to sign up for the first time on our application, then we want to first of all hash the password. To hash the password, we have a variable hashed password equal to await bcrypt.js. This is the package that we have. We need to import that, which we will do after all of this is done. So this will basically take this bcrypt.js and hash it. We need to pass in the password and the salt, which is 8. After getting the hashed password with us, we need to create a user model instance. So we have let user equal to new user. And here we need to pass in all the properties of the user. Our user is going to have 3 properties. The email, the password, and the password in our user is going to be named as in password. But here we have hashed password that we need to store. Make sure to not store this password, otherwise there will be a big problem later on because our password will get manually stored in our database and we wouldn't want that ever. And finally we need the name. And as I mentioned, we are not using email as email, name as name, because, well, why do we want to use that when we have a shortcut present with us, which is just this. After that, we have created this instance, but our MongoDB doesn't know that we want to save it. So we'll just use user equal to await user.save. We are saving it, and then MongoDB will add 2 more properties, which is ID, which is the randomly generated ID, and a version, which it doesn't really matter. That just tells how many times this user has been updated. And then we need to return this user so that we can save it in our state management tool as we move ahead. And that's why I saved it as user equals await user.save. If we just use it as user, then in our client side, we won't be able to access the ID of the user, and it's very important to have them. And then the final step is just to return the error. Here we are using 500 as error because there's some server error because of which we found this error. Here it was a bad request because user with the same email already existed. But here we have 500. That means there's some server error and it's not their fault, it's our fault basically. And then we will just send in the error with e.message. Here we add message because it was a bad request. Here it is an error. So this is our signup route. Now the next step is first of all to add bcrypt.js at the top of this. So import it here. Then we also need the user model here. So for the user model, we are going to create a new folder in the server called models, and here call it user.js. So for the user model, again we are going to import mongoose here. No need of express because we're not creating any routes here. Then we need to create a user schema. User schema is basically the structure of how the user is going to look like. And we're going to use mongoose.schema. Of course, if you're using any other database, you'll have to use the model supplied by there. Otherwise, you'll have to manually create a user model just by using plain JavaScript. Now in the mongoose.schema, after that we are also going to return this user, which is using module.exports, because we don't want this user, which is our model, which we're going to create in a bit, accessible to this file only. We want every other file to communicate with it. That's why we are using module.exports. Now here in the mongoose.schema, we're going to have our first property called name. And this is how we are going to create it. The name of the property, which is the key, and then the value. The value is going to be an object, and here we are going to have required true. Basically, the user will have to enter the name of the user. It can't go empty. Then we want the type, which is string. The name is always going to be a string, and then we need to trim it. We are going to trim it in our server side, not in our client side. Of course, if you want, you can trim it in the client side as well. It doesn't really matter. Then we need email. Even here, we are going to have required true, type string, and trim true. Similar to the name part, nothing really different. Then we will have a validate property, which is the different thing. So in validate, we are going to validate if this is a proper email or not. So how are we going to do that? Well, we're going to pass in the validator argument. This validator argument will provide us with the value that the email has. And then here we're going to check if it's a valid email or not. To check if it's a valid email or not, of course, you can put in your own configuration, but I'm going to use regex for it. So I'm going to save it in the variable. This is the regex that I'm going to use. If you don't want to understand it, I'll mention it in the description below. And then I'm going to return value, which is this value dot match, which will help us compare this value to this regex. So this value is going to be of the type string. Then it will match it with the regex to tell us if the email is a valid email or if it's not a valid email. After that, we need the message. So in case there is an error, that means the validator returns false. Then what message do we need? Well, this is a message. Please enter a valid email address. Don't give us 123@456.com. Please. Then we need password, which is going to have required true and type string. Of course, you can put in validate here as well if you want the password to be at least 6 characters long, but that's not my requirement. After that, we are going to take this user. This is what we are returning, right? We're going to create this. As of now, this is just a schema. We need to convert this to a model. So it's going to be using mongoose.model. This is how we are going to convert. And this model accepts 2 parameters now. First is the schema. So the first is the name of the schema. Then the schema itself. So this is the user schema and this is the user schema object or the user schema. I hope you got that. Basically, our collection is going to be named user. Now we can go to our auth.js and import this user. So if I type in user again, you can see it asks me to auto import it and here I get it. I'm going to save this much. Now, if you want, we can directly get started with the client side. But before that, if you want to test it and not directly jump into the UI side of the thing, you can test it using this VS Code extension, which is Thunder Client. With Thunder Client, we can click on new request and here it will help us create a new request. I already have one created so that it doesn't waste much of our time. Here I have it, a post request with HTTP localhost 3000, which is our URL to connect. Then /API/signup, which is the path of the URL that we need, this part. And in the body, we are going to use the JSON format. We are going to pass in name, which is Naman, email as naman12@gmail.com, and password as test123. Then I'm going to click on send, and here it is. Our name is the same, email is the same, but here the password you can see it's hashed now. Now you might be wondering, how are we going to, check with our sign-in password whenever the user just signs in, right? I mean, this is a password. And how will we connect plain text with this? But we look into that in the sign-in process. Here we also have our ID, which is randomly generated by MongoDB, and the version. It is 0 right now because we haven't updated yet. Now let's try checking if this part is working. Basically, if there's an existing user, we need to say user with the same email already exists. So I'm going to take the same thing and send it across, but you can see user with the same email already exists. So now that our sign-up route is working, let's get started with the sign-in route. Let's write a server-sided code first and then we'll dive into the client side. What do you think? Right? Alright, so now let's get started with the sign in part. So here we're going to similarly have auth router.post, pass in the URL as API/signin instead of signup. Here we're going to have signin. Then the callback function is going to be asynchronous with the request and the response. Then we're going to have our try and a catch block. In the try block, we're going to have our constant, the name, email, password. Instead of name, we are just going to have email, password, because in a login user, we just have email and a password. No need to store name there. Then we need to check if the user with the same email already exists or not. So if the user with the same email already exists, then we can move further. Otherwise, we'll just have to tell that the user needs to register first. So here we are going to find that user again using user.find1, and now you can see user labeled because we have already imported user here. So after having that, we just need to check if there is no user. So if there is no user, we need to send in an error message saying user with this email does not exist. Again, the status is 400 and this is the message. Then we need to check if the password that the user has typed in is matching to the one that is there in our database. Now, how are you going to check that? Because that password over here is in English or in a text format, but that one is an encrypted password, which is obviously in a text format, but it's not encrypted. Alright. So we are just going to use bcrypt.compare. This is another function that's provided by bcrypt.js package or dependency. Here we need to first pass in the password that we need to compare it with. This is the password that we need to compare and the password we need to compare it with. So it will be this user's password. So we can just have user.password because here we have the user's details. So if there is no user here, we've already returned. This code will not get executed. But if the user has some data, then we need to get user.password and we can access that because we are finding user. And user.password is what we are using. If we just go to the user model, you can see user.password. Now, if it is a match, then we can execute further. But if it's not a match, then we need to tell that the password is incorrect. So we'll just return res.status400.json incorrect password. Note here we have used message. In case of a bad request, we are always going to send in a message. But whenever there is a server error, we are going to send in an error similar to this. So if it is not a match, we are telling it's an incorrect password. Now we need to get a token, and to get a token which we will save in our database, we need to use JWT. What is JWT? JSON Web Token, the dependency that we installed. So we are just going to have constant token equal to JWT.sign. Then we will pass in the ID of the user, which can be found using user._ID. And we have underscore here because here if you come and let's say I type in naman123 and send in, this ID is __ID. If you can't see it properly, I'll copy this and paste it here. You can see it's _ID. This is how MongoDB stores its ID. So I'm using _ID. And we are signing and creating a JWT based on this ID. And then we need to also mention the password key. This token is going to be of a lot of use. This token is going to get stored in our database or in a local storage database, just to be very clear. We are going to use shared preferences to store this token to our local storage database so that we can use that just to know if we are logged in or not. And if you're logged in, then we need to get all the user's detail and everything correctly. This is how important this token is going to be. This is going to be a differentiating factor to know if the user is logged in or not. Basically, if the user is authenticated or not. Basically, if your app has a feature of chatting for only authenticated user, this token is going to help us with that. Because this token will help us in creating a middleware, which we will create. So after having that token, we need to return that to the user so that we can save it in our, provider and in our application throughout. So we are just going to return res.json. Now here comes the problem. We need to store token as well as the user so that everything goes correctly in our database or in our provider, sorry. So I'm going to pass in the token first and then all the user data. So if I just pass in user, it will send all the data which we don't want. We want only certain data which can be found using user._doc. If we just pass in user, it will send a load of data and it won't be able to map and pass through that data to get the correct data. But user._doc will give it all the necessary data like email, password, name, user ID, all the necessary stuff. Great. Having that in place, we just need a catch block, and here it is. res.status 500.json error e.message. So this is our sign-in route. Now let's go to the client side. Of course, there are certain more routes that we can add, and we are going to add, like we want to check if the token is valid or not. But first, let's get into the client side just to know what we are doing and understand it better. So I'm going to close all the save files here and now add in the dependency called provider, because that's how we are going to manage the state in our application. And before we forget, go in the main.dart file and wrap it with the widget known as multi-provider. We also need to import provider. Now we need to add the required argument of providers. Now our first provider we need to create, which is user provider. So here I'm going to create a folder called providers, and our very first provider is user provider.dart. If you're using any other state management like Riverpod or GetX even, just try to understand the concept and implement it there. So here we're just going to have a user provider created that extends a change notifier. I'm not going to explain provider here. A detailed video on provider is going to come in as the next video. You can find that. But basically, here I want to edit the user data. To edit the user data, I'm not going to simply store it in a map or something. It might be very inconvenient. So I'm going to create a model for it, and the model is going to be user.dart. I'm going to call it user class and then define all the required arguments that are there for the user. So these are the arguments that we need: an ID of the user, the name of the user, email, token, and password. Password is optional. If you want to store it, you can store it. And if you don't want to, don't store it, because this password is anyways a hashed password. Storing it in user provider doesn't or wouldn't make sense to me. But anyways, it's fine. If you want to store it, it's hashed password. If you want to display it to the user, you can display. I don't know why you would. But anyways, now I can click on this bell icon and generate a constructor first so that all of this error disappears. In case you're wondering why I got this option, you can just go to this extensions tab and find Dart data class generator. This extension allows me to do it. After that, I will generate JSON serialization, and that's all that I need. But make sure in from map you add map_id, because whenever we use it, just come back to our Thunder client, and here in our sign up, if you see, id is _id. So if we convert the we convert the map that we get into a user model, we have to use this map, which is _id. We need to use this property. So if we just pass an ID, it will give us an error. So I'm going to use map_id. Also here, we can ignore the ID part. Of course, we are not going to pass in the ID every time. And anyways, the ID is going to be empty whenever we want to send data to the server side. If you want, you can also eliminate token from here, but I'm just going to keep it just to show you it's fine even if you keep ID, but I'm just trying to make it as neat as possible for me. I'll just come in here and the user and create the user model, which is user, import it, here we have it, user equal to user, and then pass in all the required arguments. ID is going to be empty, everything in fact is going to be empty. Also make sure to make this user a private variable, because I want the instance of this user to not be called whenever user provider gets there, because for that I'm going to create a getter, which is this user. So whenever we want the instance of this user, we're going to use this user, not this one. So I'm making this private, but whenever user is called, we're going to return this private. It just looks as a great way of writing code, and also it will prevent certain bugs in the future. Now we need to create a variable so that we can set the user to whatever value we want. So here I'm going to create a function called setUser. It's going to be a string and user. Basically, whatever data we get from the parameter is going to be in a JSON format, but it will be in a string in Dart. And here what I'm going to do is set this variable equal to user.fromJSON. So whatever JSON that is there, this part, we are going to take this JSON and from that create the user model and set it to this user variable. And then of course notify all the listeners. That's why we are using change notifier, right? And similarly, we are going to create the user model as well. So we are going to have set user from model. Here, as you can understand, we are going to have a user model. So from this model, we are going to set this user. And we did that. Now we'll just notify the listener, and we'll just notify the listener, and we're done. That's how simple it gets. Now we just go to the main.dart file and add the provider called change notifier provider. And here, this is of no use to us, the build context that we have. So I can just mark it as underscore and pass in the user provider here. After saving it and wrapping all of that, we can use this user provider everywhere. Now the next part is in the lib folder. We are going to create another folder called services and save our first service, which is auth_services.dart. So for auth services, you're going to need a dependency called HTTP. If you want, you can also use DO, which is another package just like HTTP, but you can say it has more features. In this tutorial, I'm going to use HTTP and make sure to import it. I've also imported other things that we might need. For example, material.dart, the user model, and the utility file so that I can display errors using a snack bar. I'm going to create the class of auth service right now, then have a function called SignUpUser. In this SignUpUser function, first of all, we need a build context so that we can display a snack bar, because to display a snack bar, we need scaffold messenger.off context. So I'm importing context. Usually to unit test as well and make your code neater, you definitely don't need build context here. But just to simplify my life and, just to give you a brief knowledge of what to do just to authenticate the user, this is how we are going to do it. Then we are going to have all the necessary things like email, password, and name. Then this is going to be an asynchronous function because we are going to use HTTP to communicate with our server. Then we need a try and a catch block here. In the try block, we are going to have our user model created, which is going to be user, and make sure to import it. I've imported it here. The ID is going to be empty for now, and even as I said, we're not going to use it even if we use user.toMap anytime. Then we have name, email, and password, and then the token also empty. Then we are going to use http.response. If you can see, I've used a suffix over here, http.response, so that I can use http before it and http.post. And then in the http.post, first thing we need to pass in is URI. So for that, I'm going to use URI.parse and then pass in the URI. Here we are going to create a class with a static instance of URI where we are going to store localhost 3000. We'll get to it, but for now, let's complete the process. Then we have /API/signup. Exactly like we had in the server file. So if we just go there in the auth.js route, here we have our /API/signup. Then we need to pass in a body so that here it can access all three objects. So we have used user.toJSON. If we just come over here, toJSON is basically encoding the toMap function, and toMap is this. We've removed the ID. If you want, you can remove the token, doesn't really matter. Then we need to pass in these headers. These are very essential while using HTTP and Nodejs. Otherwise, it won't work. Then we need to handle this error handling part. So this res can be either status code 200, 400 or 500. That's how we have configured our whole process, right? If it's a success, then 200. If there's a bad request, 400. And an internal server error, 500. So I'm going to use HTTP error handle, but we don't have that method. And why do we even have a method? Well, HTTP error handling method is going to be very similar, We're continuously going to use it in every function that we're going to have. Not just for sign up user, even sign in user or anything else. Whenever we communicate with the server, we need this HTTP error handling. So why do I, manually copy and paste it every time? Instead, I'll just create a function for it in the utils.dart package. So here I've added two packages and imported them. Dart convert. I've not added it. It's just there with the Dart language. Then HTTP, again using the suffix HTTP. Here I'm going to create the next function, which is HTTP error handling function. So I want HTTP response required argument, then the build context, then the onSuccess function. So what to do when there's a success, right? If there's an error, we know we need to show the snack bar, but in case of success, it really differs from each function. Sign in, we might have to do something else. Sign up, we might have to do something else. That's why. So here again, we are going to have a switch block. Then we are going to check the status code. As I said, status codes are going to play a major role. If you mess up in one of this, you'll get a different error and different functionality altogether. So we are going to use a switch saying if the status code is 200, that means everything is alright. Okay. Then we need to execute this onSuccess function and then break it so that it doesn't go to the next case. And the next case is 400. In case of 400, we need to show a snack bar and then we pass in the context. Here it's in a string format. So basically if I just remove this JSON decode, it will not get executed. You can see it's giving us an error. So first we need to decode this and then we can use message tag on this. And we're using message over here because every time there's a status 400, we are passing in message. Now you can see everything is coming together. And then again we'll break it. Then we have case 500. And as you can understand, we're going to show a similar snack bar. But instead of message, we're going to have error. Great. Because every time there's a 500 status, we are displaying an error. Awesome. Now we also need default. So because if we mess up somewhere, basically if we have case 200, 400 and 500, then we have no other cases left and we've not handled it over here. We need to show this response.body that, yeah, you've not handled me, please handle me over here. Great. Now we can come over here and have HTTP error handling. You can see the named parameter context is now required. It's asking us because we have imported utils.dart. So here we are going to pass in the response because that's what it requires. This is the response, then the context, and then the onSuccess. So whenever there is a success, what do we need to do? Well, now let's understand what we need to do. In case of success, we'll just tell the user that, yeah, your account has been created, log in again. Because if the user can't log in again, that means they've forgotten their password. So this is a kind of verification we're going to add. So here I'm simply displaying account created, login with the same credentials. And then I'm going to show snack bar in case this part gets failed, because this is the asynchronous part. So if this gets failed, we are going to show a snack bar showing this error. Now we need to create a constant class with URI. In utils.dart, I'm going to create constants.dart, create a class constant here. and then a static instance of URI with this passed in HTTP. Don't pass in HTTPS, otherwise it won't work for you. It's not secured, it's HTTP only. Then we will pass in localhost 3000. This is a very convenient way of doing it, because if we upload this to Nodejs or any other website to deploy our server, then we will have to change this URI. So instead of manually changing it everywhere in every route, we just have one route where we need to change. Great. Now we can import this. So we have constants.dart imported, and this is our signup user function. So just to test it, I'm going to go to the signup screen, scroll up, we have our function created. Now we need to create the instance of this auth service class. And then I'm going to take this auth service and have auth service dot signup user. Then we will pass in the build context, the email, which is basically email controller dot text. Even if you don't trim it, it's fine, because we're going to trim it in the server side. Then we have password as password controller dot text, and the name similarly name controller dot text. After saving this much, let's try to bind. First of all, let's see if it's bound to this function. On pressed it is. So let's try to sign up. If I come over here, enter my name Rivaan, enter my email naman12, and I'm using naman12 for a reason. That's because I've already stored it in the database when I was testing it using Thunder client, if you remember it correctly. And then the password, which is test123. Then click on sign up, and you can see user with the same email already exists. Then I can have 34 as well, and then click on sign up. Account created, login with the same credential. If you want to check, you can go to your database. Here it is. I'm going to click over here, go to the collections, and as you can see, we have our users collection over here. And if we scroll down, naman12 is there when we first tested, then naman123 when we second tested. In the third test again, we used naman12@gmail.com, and then finally naman1234. And this is our password, properly hashed. Even if the user gets our data from our database, he has no clue what they're looking at. The next part is the login part. Let's get started with it. So here I'm going to create the function. So I'm going to similarly create another function called signinUser, where I'm going to have a build context again, then the email and password. No name here because signin doesn't have a name. Then we have asynchronous function, obviously HTTP. Then we have a try block and a catch block. Catch block, directly we are showing the error, no explanation there. Then we have the user provider instance over here. We are declaring it first because later on we are going to have async await calls there. We are dealing with futures there. When we are dealing with futures, we definitely don't want context there. Otherwise, we'll get the warning of do not use build context across async gaps. Similar to this, we are going to have navigator as well, because again, we're using that ahead when we have async await calls. Then we have the HTTP post request. Again, where are we going to post it? The localhost 3000/API/signin this time. So we have /API/signin. Then we are going to pass in this body, which is JSON encode, and then pass in the map, which is email and password. If you want, you can create an instance of the user class, something like this. So we have final user equal to user. Pass in all of this as empty, but the email and password is going to be like this, and then use user.toMap instead of JSON. Instead of this, we can have user.toJSON, and we're done. But I just wanted to show you an alternate way of doing this. That's why I took this method. Now we need to handle the error because we have this res and we want to know if it's success or a failure. So of course we also need the headers, my bad, because as I mentioned, you won't be able to go ahead without this. Then we need HTTP error handler. We'll pass in all the required stuff like response, context, and an on success. In the on success, we need to realize now what we do. When we are logging in, we need to make sure that we store this data in our local storage because we are going to get a token. If you remember, if we scroll down here, we have token that is being passed, and this token is going to help us persist the state. And the persistence, we'll get to it in a while, but The main part is we now need to store this token to a local storage. For that, we're going to use the dependency called shared preferences. This is the thing that we're going to use. So make sure to install that and import it here. I have shared preferences already installed here. So we are going to have shared preferences is equal to await shared preferences.get instance. We got the instance of this shared preferences. Now we need to store this token. So we'll have, well, first of all, before even storing the token, we want to make sure that the user is getting the correct data. So we are setting the user from this res.body, and res.body contains all the data like token and name, email, password, everything. So we are setting it here. We're not using set user from model because we don't have a model yet. So after having stored all of this, now we will store this token to our local storage. So we have preferences.setString. We'll pass an Auth token. This is a token string that we have. If you want, you can save this in constants because we are going to use this a bit in our application. And then we will pass in the token. Token will be found using JSON decode. We'll decode this body and then get access to this token. Otherwise, you can also use provider.offContext listen false dot user dot token. But you can't use this user provider because this user provider is set listen to false. That means even if this updated, this part doesn't know that token is something. It will return an empty string. Having this done, we just need to use navigator.push and here pass in the route that we need to push to, which is the home screen. After saving all of this, I think we're done. Looks good enough, so we can just take this sign in user, go to the sign up user, copy this final auth service line, go to the login screen, paste it in here, import the auth service, and here have auth service dot sign in user. Pass in the context, then the email, which is email controller.text. Again, no need to trim it. And if you want, you can even trim it because we are not trimming this in the server side. We are trimming this only in the client side, but maybe the user wants their password to have the space. Maybe, we don't know. So we have password controller.text. And there we have it. This is all that we need. Now if I come here and I'll take this email. So I'm going to select this all, copy. Password is test1234. And I log in. Here you can see we are getting this error. And we are getting this error because we need to restart. Actually, I'll restart the whole application because I installed two dependencies, provider and shared preferences. When there's changes in pubspec.yaml file, you always need to restart your app. Alright, so our app is launched. I'm going to paste the email again, then have the password test123, then click on login, and you can see JWT is not defined. This is the server error, and we are showing the data quite well. And the reason for that is JWT here is not defined. We need to import that. We have not imported it anywhere. So we'll have constant JWT equal to require JSON web token. Since therefore this was an error over here, basically we have not defined it over here. It went in the catch block, and in the catch block we passed in the error here. Now since there was an error here, when we communicated, we got the error here, and the status code was 500, so it sent this snack bar. This is how the whole process worked. Now let's try to log in, and you can see we are getting to the next page. Now if you want to see how we got to the next page, or you want to see if the provider data is getting stored correctly or not, you can go to this home screen. And in the home screen, first of all, have that user provider user. So this is how we are going to have it. Final user equal to provider.of user provider context.user, because this was a getter. Now let's import these two things. We need user provider and we need provider. Having both of them, let's print out the user's email instead of the yes and remove constant, because now it's not a constant anymore. Now you can see naman1234@gmail.com showing up. If you want, you can show the user's name, and here we have the name, the user's ID as well, and here we have it. And there we have it. The hashed password is showing up. I don't know why you would show it, but that's great. Now let me show you the next thing that we're going to work on, which is if I restart this, here I am. Well, I went back to the sign up screen. Why is that happening? In the main.dart file, I've defined the home as a constant sign up screen. I don't want that. I want it to know if I'm logged in. I want to show the login home screen, otherwise the sign up screen. So how are we going to achieve that? Simple for us. In the auth services, we're going to create a new function, and even before auth services, we need to go to the auth.js route, because in auth.js we need to create a new route which is to get all the user data. So here basically I'm going to get all the user data. What does that mean? Well, whatever user I have, based on them, I want to get all the users data. And how are we going to know that? Well, that's where this line is going to come in place, which is authrouter.get/. So whenever there's localhost 3000 /, I want to get the user data, but we can't get user data for all the users, right? I mean, why would anyone want all the users data unless they're admin, or we want the search screen or something like that? So here we are going to have our middleware, which is auth. This is going to extract the token and let us know if the user is authenticated or not. So if the user is authenticated, then only we can move further. Otherwise, it will send an error over there as well. Here, we will have to create the auth middleware. But before that, let's get all the user data. So we have constant user equal to await user.findById request.user. You won't understand this ID if you're wondering user.findById is request.user how. You'll understand only after we work on the auth middleware. And then we are going to have rest.json. We are going to pass in this user document, just like this one, and then the token, which is request.token. Again, you wouldn't understand this unless we work on auth middleware. So let's get started with it. In the server folder, I'm going to create a new folder called middleware and then have auth.js. So over here, what we are going to do is have the instance of this JSON web token before we forget about it. And then I'm going to create this auth function. This auth function is going to be asynchronous and it will have three properties: request, response, and next. Next means when we get to it, I'll tell you. Otherwise, you wouldn't understand it. But basically, it means we can move to the next function, because if we see here, we have auth here. But in the auth part, this is the callback function. So if we pass in next, that means we can move over here. Otherwise, it won't move to the callback function. It will just remain there and the function will get stopped. So this is why we have the middleware as well. If we don't call the next function, we won't give it to this callback. And it's particularly very useful because you just think about it. If the authentication part fails, why would we move to this part? This part basically tells without any verification, get me the user's data. So that would be an exception because we wouldn't have the user's data. So coming back to this, here first of all, let's export it even before we forget it. Then we have the try and catch block. Then we have the token. Now, what is the token? Request.header x auth token. In the client side, we are going to attach the token as a header, not as a body. It's the particular convention. We're going to pass in as a header, and later on when you want to do authenticated work only, like chatting for example, you want only authenticated users to chat or add product to a cart, then you will have a header, and in the body you would have all other data. Like if you're chatting, then you want the body to be the name of the user, the text that they have sent, So why would you pass in token in the body? The token will be in the header. So we are getting access to the token using request.header, and in the client side we'll pass in the header. Then we are going to check if there is no token that is passed in. That means that there is no token, so access has been denied. That's a very useful message for us, because us as a developer, if we forget to pass in the auth token, then it will tell us that we have not passed in any token, access has been denied. Then we want to check. So basically, if there is no token, then we have returned it. That means that this function won't get executed, and we have not called next. So this part will also not get executed. Then we have verified. So here basically we are verifying with JWT, JSON Web Token. If the token that we have and the password key, we have to pass this in. If I pass in password key, it will not verify, because here the password key is this, and here if the password key is this, they won't match. So you have to pass in the exact password key as this one. Then here we have password key, and it will verify. This is JWT dependencies task. So after it has verified, and this verification is important. Why? Because what if the user got access to the local storage database or the shared preferences, and they go inside, manipulate the token, and then give it to us? Well, that's very weird, and it might be a sort of hacking into. So you want to check if the JWT is verified or not. If it's verified, then only we want to move further. Otherwise, we will check. If it's not verified, then we can say token verification failed, authorization denied. Simple enough. And here we've passed in 401. Even here 401. 400 is bad request. 401 means authorization is required. That's a very useful status. Then we will set request.user equal to verified.id. If you remember, if we go back, we have signed JWT using this ID. So to get that ID of the user, we can have request.user equal to verified.id. If we don't attach this to request.user, it will think here it will get us a problem, because we don't know the user's ID. That's why we need to store it over here. If we just set it to request, that means all the other data is gone, and that's very important for us, right? So we will set it to request.user and equal to verified.id. Then we will also set request.token equal to token. Just like this. Then we are calling next. After we call next, this function will get run. If it's not verified, it will return, and this next will not get called, so we won't get ahead, and it will not get us the user's data. After this part, we just need to display an error in case of a catch block. Simple enough. Now we can come here and add the auth middleware. So import it, and we have it. Having that, we can create another route now, which is if we want to check if the token is valid or not. So we need to check the token is valid or not. For that, we are going to create a separate route as well. So whenever we get the user's data, before getting that, we need to check if the token is valid or not. And it's going to be very similar to this part, right? Here also we have added that logic basically. But now we need to create this over here as well, because auth middleware will be used every single place wherever you need to perform authenticated tasks. But what if you want a separate route only for once? That will tell you if the token is valid or not, and then you won't move ahead. So here we have our route created /token is valid, which is asynchronous. Then we have request response, very similar, the same try catch block, the same status error code. Here we are going to get access to the token using request.header, similar to this one. Then we are going to check. If there is no token, then we are going to return rest.json false. And we can also pass in the boolean value, you might already know. So we have passed in the boolean value here. So if there is no token, the token is not valid, so we return false. But if there is a token, then we are checking if it's verified. So we are using jwt.verify, similar to this again. And if it's not verified, then we can pass in res.json false again. Finally, if all of these get passed through, we are going to get the user's ID. So user is equal to user.find by ID. Then we are going to check if there is no user with that ID. So we are using user.find by ID verified.id. If the user with that ID does not exist, then we are going to return res.json false. But if the user exists, then we can send in res.json true. Of course, if you want, you can pass in the status codes here as well, but I don't find the need to do it. So I'll just pass in res.json false. Perfect. Now I'm going to close all the save files. I think authentication part from the client side is all done. Now here in the auth services part, we need to get started with the get user data functionality. So for the get user data, we'll create a function. It is asynchronous. Then we'll import the build context just to display the snack bars. Then we have a try and catch block. Here we are showing the snack bar. Then we have the user provider again, just to avoid the warning of don't use build context across async gaps. Then we have shared preferences here, where we are getting the instance of the shared preference. Then we are having the string token, which can be nullable. And here we are basically using shared preferences to get the string. So we have stored XOR token here. You can see set string, but here we are getting it, and it can be nullable because what if the user hasn't stored anything at all in the database till now? So this is going to be nullable. So if the token is nullable, what do we want to do? If the token is null, then we'll just set it to an empty string, and then we're going to have token response http.post, because if the token is not null, then we want to tell. If the token is not null, then we want to check that the token that we've gotten is valid or not. So here I'm going to pass in uri.parse/token is valid. Then of course in the headers, we want the normal default header like this one. So we'll pass that in. And then as I mentioned, whenever we use token is valid or authentication middleware, we need to pass in the headers our token. And here we pass in XAuth token. Please spell all of them properly, they're very essential. Otherwise it won't work for you and you'll be wondering why it's not working. Great. Now we have the token response. So now after getting the token response, we want the response, which is token response.body. Then we are checking if the response is true, because token response.body will just reply us with the true or a false. You can see it in the auth.js route. Here it's just returning true or a false. So if the response is true, then we want to get all the user data so that we can store it in the user provider. Great. If it's not, then we don't want to do anything. So if response is true, then we get that, which is constant.uri, and make sure to put in slash, because constants.uri is localhost 3000 without a slash. So make sure to put in the slash so that you get it, and make sure to pass in get over here instead of a post, because you're getting the data and this part right here has a get, not a post. Now headers, already you have the content type like this, and of course the XAuth token, which is this token. Make sure to pass in both of them. If you don't pass this, it will tell you with this error which we have in the middleware. No auth token, access denied. Now, if the response is true, obviously we will get the data. So we'll have user provider.set user and set it. Definitely. If you want, you can just add HTTP error handling as well. It wouldn't matter. But here I'm pretty sure nothing can really go wrong. We're just getting the data. Great. Now we just need to take this get user data function, go to the main.dart file, convert this my app widget to a stateful widget. In the init state, we are going to remove this, have instance of auth service, which is final auth service equal to auth service. Now that we have the instance, we can take auth service dot get user data, pass in the build context. There we have it. Now our user provider has that data. So if it's a success, here you can see we are setting the user provider to this data. So if it's a success, then our user data provider's token will not be empty. But if it's a failure, that means that the user has not signed in. Then we are going to get the token as empty. So here in the home, I'm going to have provider.auth user provider.user.token. If it is empty, then we want to show the sign up screen. And if it's not empty, then the home screen. Good enough. This is the code if you want to take a look at it. And now you can see I'm on the main screen. Even if I refresh the application, here I am. It's working really well. So that was the login, sign up and all of the tasks with state persistence. The last task is the sign out task. But sign out, we're going to do it a bit differently. So how is it going to be different? I'm not going to pre-write the sign out user function. I'm going to write it in front of you so that you understand what the thought process is like. I've not typed it at all. So let's try to understand what we need to do. Well, first of all, we need the sign out button. So for the sign out button, I'm going to go to the home screen, add my button. So for the button, I can just go to the sign up screen, copy this elevated button and paste it over here. Now for the on press, we are going to have the sign out user option. So I'm going to copy the sign out user and have that created for sign out user. And yep, that's pretty much it. Now I want to see the sign out. So I can change this to sign out. Now in the auth services, I will have void sign out written here. And it's again going to be, it's going to be asynchronous because I'm going to use shared preferences. So I'm going to take this and paste it in here. Why do I need shared preferences? Pretty simple, right? Because we are determining if the user is logged in or not based on this function, which is get user data. Get user data is basically checking if the get string function, this token, is null or not. If the token is null, that means that the user is not logged in. So here I'm getting the preferences, and again I also need this token. So I'm just going to take this token. Actually, I don't even need the token. I'm just going to have preferences.setString, take this XOR token and set it to an empty string. That's pretty much it. Here we are checking if the user is logged in or not based on this token preferences, XOR token. I've set it to empty again. That means there's no token data in our local storage. That means we have logged out. So automatically, of course, it won't go to this screen. So what I want to do here is use navigator. And if I use navigator here, you'll see that we get the warning again, which is navigator.offContext. Of course, we need the build context here. Dot push and remove until, and we get that. Now you can see if I hover over this, do not use build context. So what I'm going to do is final navigator equal this to navigator.offContext, paste it here, then use navigator, then I have navigator.push and remove until, then we have material page route context, and then we pass in the constant sign up screen. There's where we want to go, right? So we are just setting the preferences to an empty string and then going to this sign up screen. And we are using push and remove until so that even if we try to go back, we can't go back. There's no back option there. And that's pretty much it. If we didn't do this task, we would just have this and it will just go to the next screen and it would work. But what if we refreshed it afterwards? Then again we would come to this screen because again all of this would process and there would be user data left. Here we are just changing the route, but here we are adding some functionality to tell that token is empty. There's no more user signed in. Great. Now I can take this sign out, go to the home screen, and have auth service, and here I'm directly calling it in. I'm not creating the instance of this auth service. The reason for that is if I create an auth service thing here instance, then this can't be a constant, but I want it to be a constant. So of course I can't do that. And here we'll have auth sign and we'll pass in sign out. We also need build context, so I'll pass in the context, and that's pretty much it. I'll take then the sign out user, and since we need to pass in the build context, we'll have to do it something like this, so that we store the address. Basically we're calling it. Now if I click on sign out, I go to the sign up screen. If I try to go back, I am not going back, and if I refresh my screen, you can see we are on the sign up. So this was my thought process, and this was the whole tutorial. We've learned about signing in, signing up, persisting the state of the application, and obviously a lot about middleware. Now if you want to focus on your application, and if you want to authenticate people to perform the task of the application, you can use this auth middleware everywhere. It's a very neat way of doing stuff, in my opinion at least. So this was it for the tutorial. Thank you so much for watching. See you in the next video.